Now, let me start. I know we start this program by talking about Africa and what's going on in Africa before we zero into the main reason why you came in here today. The first thing is I want to get your view on what happened, how you saw the speeches made by African leaders at the United Nations General Assembly here in New York last week.
Well, as far as speeches go, they did well. Apart from Akufo-Addo that you mentioned of Ghana, or the Nigerian Tinubu, or Ruto of Kenya, who talked about the fact that Africans are not beggars and all of that. So, great. I think their speeches, even Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, their speeches highlighted the problem, right, with the system of power and global international relations as they are manifested in the World Economic Forum, the UN, the Bretton Woods organizations, IMF, and all of that. The fact that Africa has not received its fair share in international global relations. But of course, that has a long history that go back to the age of slavery and later colonization, that the continent is still dealing with the aftermath of these two great catastrophes. So the speeches of the African heads of states in many different ways highlighted these problems. Now, from my side, I'm waiting on them to do their own part, their responsibilities as leaders of our African countries.
Now, I know that when they make these speeches, they go home. People like you in academia will have to deal with translating, transmitting, interpreting, and trying to shape up policies and teach people about Africa. What do you think about this reparation that has not stopped because some leaders continue to press for that? What do you think about that? What's the nature of it if it should happen? And how does that conflict with people who were taken out, or descendants of people who were taken out of Africa as slaves? They are also demanding a reparation from Africa.
Yes, there were multiple injuries and multiple victims of slavery, industrial slavery. Let's be clear about that. That we're referring to the industrial slavery by Western European nations on the African continent. And so there's no either or here. When you think about the fact that millions of the prime population of Africa were taken, of course, sometimes in collaboration with the then kings and power players on the continent, but primarily driven often through force by these European stakeholders. And so the fact that the African continent for generations, centuries, was deprived of its prime population, that were then dehumanized. Many of them died in that transatlantic journey and ended up in the United States, where they remained at the very bottom, right, of the social scale, and have also suffered under the white hegemony of the Americas in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil, in Argentina, and elsewhere. So there are multiple victims, and there are different claims that we can think of, right, made when we think about restitution or reparation, which is to say, how do we repair the injustices of the past that is directly connected to the institution of industrial slavery? So the African Americans, the Black diaspora in Brazil, of course, as some of us might know, that the largest Black diaspora is in Brazil, though we tend not to hear much about the experiences there. So the African diaspora has an important claim to reparative justice that need to be done to, in a sense, repair the damages, the hurt, the pains, and the systemic devaluation of their lives and property over these centuries. The African continent, on the other hand, lost as a result of industrial slavery its prime population. And there's a direct connection between African underdevelopment and the devastation of its human population as a result of industrial slavery. So they do have their own claims to slavery, precisely because that very institution is what Europe and the United States relied on for their own development. We don't need to go back to Walter Rodney's important book on the subject, but we just need to look at many of the corporations, the multinationals, that some of which still exist today, have their ancestry to these institutions that were set up in Europe to carry out slavery in Africa and in the Caribbeans and the Americas.
Thank you. For those who push back on this, they point to the fact that Africans have been on their own sending money back to the same Europe and America, money stolen out of Africa, that on their own, they are also sending their own people. Their own people are struggling to get back to these Western nations, basically to work for them. What do you say to that?
Well, the question is, which Africans are we referring to? Are they talking about people who have stolen from their communities, whether as private citizens or officials of African governments who are sending illegally acquired money overseas? There will always be thieves in any society. So we cannot be talking about thieves and people who have absolutely no interest in their communities, in their societies and nations, what they do, as if that then is a good way to think about or even discuss what we're talking about. Nor do we have to deal with cartels that have preyed on impoverished Africans to, exploit them by sending them in masses to Europe, promising better lives, but which we know often end in tragedy. So we cannot, bring in these international criminal cartels and what they have done to the poor, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. If you look at Latin America and you see the migrations happening, because their own societies, their leaders have not done well in cahoots with international organizations and European powers. And this is really the point, that we're not talking about the failures of African leadership, which of course we must talk about, but we must not forget that oftentimes they are working at the beck and call of international organizations and international powers who are fighting their own battles to protect their own national interests. So I think we have to be clear about the historical injustice of slavery and colonialism and the impact that they still have today on Africa, regardless of the nature of the leadership we have, whether we have military or democratic leadership in Africa. The impact of the historical industrial slavery and colonialism still affect every African country, regardless of their political leadership. And we must not forget that.
Thank you so much. Let me also zero in on what Bola Tinubu said, Nigeria's president. He recommended a Marshall Plan for Africa. In the sense which he also talked about that Africa is not to be pitied, that it's not to be avoided. And so how do you see that?
The question is, why should the United States or Britain carry out a Marshall Plan for Africa, what would be the argument for that? Why would they do that from their own end? So I think we are comparing two different historical circumstances. First and foremost, the United States government has not acknowledged, the crimes of slavery till today. I am not aware that the government of England has done that either. So why would they carry out a Marshall Plan where they have not acknowledged that their countries took part in something that was, deplorable, in fact, criminal, as far as human civilization is concerned? If you look at what happened with the Marshall Plan, and for those of us who might not be fully aware of the circumstances of that. So at the end of the Second World War, with the devastation of European states, which, by the way, made it possible for African decolonization to happen because they had become very weak and impoverished as a result of the devastation of the Second World War. So they could no longer hold on to their colonial territory. So, but that's by the way. These European nations were completely devastated, and the United States came with this idea of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was not an act of American benevolence. It was a plan that was set up first to ensure America's supremacy, and two, to ensure that what was becoming, or what would become, the Cold War, that they would have a substantial influence over much of Europe as a result of the Marshall Plan. If you look at the key element of the Marshall Plan was the takeover by the dollar as the world's currency. This came out of the Marshall Plan. That Britain got the Marshall Plan was on the basis that they would give up the pound as international currency. Now, if you check how much the Marshall Plan was and what that switch did to America's power and economy till today, that the US can decide which country can have access to their reserves or not, or which country can do business with which other country, it's simply because of the dollar. The dollar was not a global international capital until the arrangement with Britain that made it possible for them to receive the Marshall Plan. So if you look at that history and context, you ask yourself, so why would the United States now carry out a Marshall Plan for Africa when they get anything they want, either by direct negotiation with African countries or by imposing their power over these countries to get any information they want, to access any of our resources as easily as they can. And they are not in any way concerned about controlling any African economy that they wish to control. So why would they then spend additional money, for the Marshall Plan? Nations are not emotional beings. Nations are not ethical beings. Nations act in their national interests. So what is the American national interest in a Marshall Plan? That's what I'll ask the Nigerian president. By the way, that's why I say that there were lots of good speeches that happened at the UN, feel good, and so forth, well written by whoever wrote their speeches. But the real issues are still going to have to be addressed by these individual leaders in their own countries, but also as a collective under the so-called, well, not really so-called, the reality of the African Union, which many of them have been dragging their feet in supporting a dream that Kwame Nkrumah devised in the 1960s when he was arguing that Africa will not be taken seriously in global affairs if it did not vie to become a nation. That's when you will have the capacity, human and otherwise, to act on the international stage. We're only gradually dragging our feet by changing, turning the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And now, eventually now agreeing on a monetary, even trade, African trade relations and all of that. So we are only gradually getting to something that Kwame Nkrumah argued for in the 1960s, and countries like Nigeria rejected that. Because they were not listening to the leftists among the African leaders at the time. They were abiding the interests or listening to the interests of the West at that point.
Interesting. Now, before we move on to Chinua Achebe Symposium that you are organizing, let me ask you about what is the relationship between the French and the Francophone African countries. We've seen several military coups in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Gabon. What is going on?
Well, it's a time of reckoning. It was long in coming. It has been an incredible scandal. What stood for independence for Francophone African countries, especially West African Francophone countries, that they got their independence. Meanwhile, their leaders were, pretty much spending much of their time in France. Their leaders saw themselves as citizens of France, even though they are supposed to be heads of states, like Senegal and Senghor and so forth. That's part of the problem. They negotiated an independence that was only really on paper, because their economies were left intact for French control. And so if you don't control your economy, how are you independent? That's why we have had the French manage the economies of these Francophone countries. Of course, for the interest of France, not for the interest of these countries. The monetary union that they have, their central banks have to get permission from that of France in order to carry out any monetary policy. And this is still largely the case, more than half a century after independence. And many of the citizens of these countries know this. But of course, their elites have more interest in biting to French interest than what is in the best interest of their citizens. And so the military coups that we're seeing are reactions, are symptoms of the problem. They are not a solution. Nobody, given especially Africa's history, believes that military coups resolve any of the endemic problems that these countries have. If you talk about the terrorism, which many of these coup plotters and military leaders now say is the reason they needed to take over and kick out the French, what have they replaced with that? Things have got much worse in Mali today than before. And I'm not making an argument or for why France should remain. But the problem is that, yes, they identify the problem. The question is, what is the solution? And I don't know how much they have actually tackled the systemic neo-colonial infrastructure that France left in the wake of independence in many of these countries. Until that is done, we'll probably have keep having cycles of coups while France is plotting to keep its powers over these African countries. Because we do know that France is now resting, because its own national identity depends on its continued control of these countries. That was what one of their prime ministers said a few years ago. So it's not a hidden agenda on the part of France.
We're going to get back to discussion on politics and arts and other things. But first of all, I want you to tell us about what you do as the director of the Africa World Initiative, which is hosting a symposium on Chinua Achebe and the trouble with Nigeria. And this weekend, yeah.
Yes, on the 29th and 30th of September. Yes, the Africa World Initiative is a new center that was established in the last 2 years here at Princeton, which is quite unprecedented, frankly, simply because institutions like mine have not always paid close attention to Africa. And there are lots of reasons for that, one of which is America as a nation actually has not really paid close attention to Africa, except once and if they see a threat from its competitors. It used to be the Soviet Union, now it's China. And that's why you see a kind of restiveness on the part of the US government and institutions to reinvest in Africa, however they are doing that. So what is going on at Princeton? We do have the program in African Studies, which I also direct. But we realized, my colleagues here at Princeton realized that the program in African Studies is no longer sufficient as a platform for dealing with Africa. And this is broadly speaking, because the African Studies as a field is primarily the humanities and the social sciences. And much of the challenges of our world today and of the African continent have to do with technology, entrepreneurship, innovation. And African Studies as a field doesn't quite capture those aspects of either knowledge production and exchange, but also the political economy. And so the Africa World Initiative is mandated to engage directly with African institutions and stakeholders in the area of science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship, but also the arts and humanities. So it's a very broadly conceived platform that provides us the resources, broadly defined, to engage in high-level contact and partnership with, of course, the right kind of stakeholders on the African continent. And that's precisely what we're doing presently with people in the government, in civil society, in corporate business on the African continent, to reimagine really what the university as an institution designed as a space for knowledge production at a high level, how it can help reimagine African economies, knowledge production, and so forth. So that's what we are doing with the Africa World Initiative. Part of that I did mention, it's not just that we're invested in science, technology, and innovation, but also the arts and humanities. And part of the latter includes a conversation, a discussion that we had with the Achebe family and the Achebe Foundation to move the Achebe Colloquium, which was his legacy project, to Princeton as a long-term home for the Achebe Colloquium. And so to inaugurate this new relationship, this coming to Princeton, we are planning this international conference, the international symposium, and then the memorial celebration of the 10th anniversary of Achebe's death. It so happens that the coincidence of the 10th anniversary of Achebe's death and the 40th anniversary of the publication of Achebe's incredible, acerbic, biting critique of Nigerian political system, The Trouble with Nigeria, which was published in 1983, we happen to have both anniversaries this year. And so we decided to inaugurate our new relationship with the Achebe Foundation with a symposium organized around the trouble with Nigeria. And then the celebration of his 13th memorial anniversary the following day. So this is what we're planning, broadly speaking, for this coming weekend. And we do have really an incredible slate of speakers from all over the world. The symposium was conceived by some of the leading Achebe scholars and literary scholars working from South Africa, from England, and from the United States. So this is what we're going to have on the 29th with His Excellency Peter Obi giving the keynote at that symposium. And then the following day, for the memorial celebration, we have His Royal Majesty, the Igwe of Ogidi Kingdom. Of course, that's Achebe's hometown. He will be present for the memorial celebration alongside some of the more influential scholars working in African politics, history, and the arts, in addition to writers like Chika Onigwe and Patrice Nganan, who is probably one of the best known Cameroonian Francophone African writers working today, and performances as well. So it's going to be 2 days of incredible intellectual exchange and discourse, and of cultural celebration of the life and work of the great icon, Chinua Achebe.
What will you say is the state of his legacy, Achebe's legacy today, 10 years after?
Well, that's what the symposium is about. So I hope that your audience will log on. It will be live streamed and listen to the experts, right? Discussing these questions. What has become of Achebe's scholarly legacy? What has his voice then got to do with what has been happening in Nigeria and the rest of the continent in terms of leadership? Because we will remember that he singularly indicted the leadership class of Nigeria and Africa for Africa's woes, for Nigeria's endemic problems. That was 1983. But if you read that book again today, you will think that he was writing for the present administration, whatever that is, right? So what we hope to do on Saturday, and what we will hear and see on Saturday, are some of the really incredible authorities on Achebe studies deal with these questions. New scholarship that's been emerging from younger scholars who are advancing Achebe's ideas as a novelist, but also as a critic, as a socio-political critic, how that has reshaped or impacted trends and directions in African literatures and social critique. So this Friday will be an incredible day to answer some of these questions that you're asking. So I don't want to anticipate that, right?
All right. But I think you can weigh in on this. When you were talking about Achebe, I was just thinking about Wole Soyinka, and somehow we associate the two of them as the two leaders in African literature. Recently, Soyinka has been intervening in Nigerian situation, and you can't help but think of, if had he been that Achebe were to be alive, how will he intervene? What is your take on Soyinka's recent interventions, especially what he said recently in South Africa during an interview with Okendebe?
Well, Soyinka is an elder, and as an African, I do respect my elders. And in this case, he's an elder in the real sense in terms of his age. He's also an elder in terms of being a writer, right, and an artist. So I speak with caution, and having said that, I think it's really unfortunate the way that he made his selective interventions in what was unfolding in Nigeria in the past year. I think it's certainly clear that he had a partisan, position, an agenda. That nearly everything I've heard him say about the elections is a criticism of Peter Obi, Labour Party, the obedience, so-called, and so forth. Not much of any concern with the very reason why both Atiku and his party and Obi and the Labour Party are in the courts today, whether it's in terms of the conduct of the elections, the questions being asked of the then candidate of the APC in terms of his backgrounds and so forth, which are still being prosecuted in the courts today in the United States, right? So for him to pay no attention to some of the concerns that produce the enthusiasm that we saw among the young people, looking to Obi because of his record and background in terms of what Achebe was complaining earlier about leadership in Nigeria, that they saw this individual, that's Peter Obi, as someone who comes close to the kind of leadership Achebe's critique anticipated. So for Soyinka to not recognize these aspects, but instead to keep either reminding these people or calling them names and so forth, I thought that as an elder, a highly respected elder, that he would have been, a bit more careful in how he addressed these questions, so that he does not appear to be partisan, except that, of course, he has not told her that he is, because if he declared his partisanship, then there won't be any problem. But seeming as if he is admonishing the young, admonishing the political class, but doing it so selectively, is something that I find personally very unfortunate. I doubt that the Chinua Achebe that I knew as a person, but also that I have encountered in my work, would have taken this, position that Soyinka. But of course, they are two different human beings. So I'm not saying he should be like Achebe, nor would I have advised Achebe in the day. Of course, if I was one of his advisors, to be like Soyinka. They are two different individuals, characters, personalities, and it shows in their utterances.
Okay, I know that your center is also, you have the new African World Literature lecture, and you are inviting Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie to come and speak. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Indeed, the Africa World Lectures is one of our signal programs, and it's designed to bring to Princeton for more than a day what we consider Africa's finest minds across fields, from the humanities to the sciences to policy making and so forth. And so Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is the inaugural lecturer for the Africa World Lectures. And so she will be in Princeton on the 25th and 26th of October. And the idea of the lectures is for the invited lecturer to speak from their perch, whatever their field is, but also from their personal experience, how they think about the Africa world. So that's what will happen in October. Next year, the second Africa World lecturer would be Abdul Razak Gurna, the Zanzibari writer, who is, of course, British and African. He will, and the last Nobel laureate from Africa in literature, he will be the second lecturer, and he will be in Princeton for 3 days, during which time he would have a lecture. There's a conversation and then meetings with Princeton stakeholders. The lecture, Chimamanda's program would be a lecture that she will give, and then she and I would have a public conversation following the lecture, and then the following day she would meet with Princeton students and stakeholders and so forth.
All right. So, you said Chimamanda, also we know that she intervened during the election. She wrote to Joe Biden a public article. And I want you to talk about the reaction, how the public reacted to Chimamanda and also to Wole Soyinka. There have been several attacks on them, and essentially even to some extent dismissal of their work. What do you think about that?
It's always unfortunate when people build icons and also smash them, based on their own perception of that very icon. I think that's what has happened here. That Soyinka's utterances about Nigerian politics has now meant that those who say that they admired him as a writer are now thinking otherwise based on what interventions he's made on the political arena. I'm not sure about that. The connection between what you thought about his writing and then what he's saying on the political arena, how one can easily make that switch to, go from an admirer of his work to, the opposite, now that he's come out to make these statements. And it's the same with Chimamanda, that those who did not like what position that she had taken with regard to Nigerian politics have now sort of started rethinking their assessment of her value, right, as a writer. We saw that happen to Oprah Winfrey in the United States when she declared her interest in Barack Obama, right? So these are things that that happen. I don't think they last, right? Because as with political discourse, they come and go. The question is what happens to the person's work. By the way, the same thing happened to Chinua Achebe when he intervened in 1983, when he published The Trouble with Nigeria. He was savaged by a segment of the public for daring to criticize in the very vociferous way that he did the Nigerian political class. We saw that also happen when he rejected the award from the Nigerian government, right? That is Chinua Achebe himself. So these things happen more frequently than not, that people move from their assessment or investment in the political realm and the way that they perceive their idols who they came about because of their work as writers or as artists and so forth, that they often conflict the two. It's hard not to, but I think that it takes a certain level of sympathy and understanding of the nature of the artistic enterprise to not easily make that conflation. I don't think, and I cannot see how my view of Soyinka's work as a writer and a dramatist will change because of his critique and criticism of the obedience. But I can also understand why a lot of people can fall to that.
Mm. Let's briefly touch on writing and African writing, especially in Nigeria. What is your take? I know you are familiar with what's going on. What is your take on the state of writing in Nigeria, knowing that Afrobeat, for instance, is gone worldwide? Nollywood is doing well across continents. Is the writers, are they in the same are they at the same level? Are they doing well?
Frankly, Nigerian writing is doing relatively well. Of course, writing has never been in competition with music, um, or film, because they are much more popular in the sense that they are made for a popular class, right? The generality of the society. And so we cannot measure success in this, with the same indices, right? But I think that Nigerian writing is doing fairly well. When you think about the younger generation of writers, and how much they have achieved through their work, whether they are living inside Nigeria or moving back and forth between Nigeria and elsewhere. And there are so many names. Yobami Adebayo is doing incredible work. Of course, we have Chika Onigwe, we have Adobe Trisha Nwobani, we have Ned Okorafor, who is, frankly speaking, one of the leading writers today in the broad genre called science fiction. She's won most of the awards that are out to be won. So there are so many writers. Chigozie Obioma, is doing great. So I am not that concerned about the state of writing in Nigeria today. We have really a healthy population of writers working in Nigeria, based in Nigeria and based overseas today.
So let me put you on the spot. Who will be the next Nobel Prize winner out of Nigeria?
That, of course, Nobel is a hard thing to guess who wins it. Sometimes it's the most innocuous writer that gets the Nobel. So saying that a Teju Cole will win the Nobel just says what I think about his work. That I think that he belongs in the finest realm of writers. If that's the question, yes, we have, really fantastic work coming out of Nigeria. And as I mentioned a few names of people that I consider at the very top of the table, right? When we are talking about contemporary literature, right? So that's the way I would think about it. There are many Nobel laureates that nobody remembers their names anymore. Achebe did not win one, but here we are celebrating the legacy, right, of his work. So, frankly speaking, we have a healthy number of writers from Nigeria who are making significant work, and people who I respect their work, and that counts a lot.
You mentioned Nnedi Okorafor and what she's doing in science fiction, which is amazing. But there's somebody else that I want to get your take on that. That's Akweke Meze and her work. But more in particular, I want you to address the she calls herself. Oh, she says God, and that let me use the proper pronoun. Them is Obanje. What is your take on that? Because I think in Igbo culture, Obanje, for those who are not Igbo, it's like Abiku in Yoruba. So what is your take on them taking over, saying?
So, yeah, I see you struggling with pronouns.
I'm struggling with it now.
And what I can say to that is, I wished European languages learned from African languages so that we don't have these crises of pronouns, because no African language that I know of has gendered pronouns, right? So maybe they really need to look to Africa so that we wouldn't have to be struggling over pronouns and people's identities, which is very important. I mean, I think that struggle is a thing on its own. But the question you ask about Obanje, and I'll talk about Obanje just so that what I would say would not be seen as a criticism of someone's position, and identity. I don't want to get into that. But the Obanje in Igbo society is not a good thing. The Obanje, and it's only because, not that the person who is Obanje is not valued, it's that the reason you have an Obanje is someone, and as with Abiku, who did not cut their ties properly when they transitioned into this realm, knowing fully well that the Igbo and many African societies, believe in a cyclical, in a cycle of life, that birth is not the beginning of life. It's only a transition point, just as death is not the end of life. It's another transition point. The Obanje is someone who, in making that transition, did not take this, what they needed to enter this realm. And so that's why they are always asking or trying to go back, because they did not have all the tools they needed in this realm. And that is why, the birth and rebirth and so forth, it's this cycle of attempts, but there's a break for that. And that is why the Obanje is not supposed to be a permanent status and state, because either the person dies and keeps returning, or that cycle is broken by the family, which is, of course, documented in Things Fall Apart, with Okonkwo's daughter, who was an Obanje, whose Iowa, that's a thing that is left on the other side, that the Obanje keeps wanting to go back and retrieve. That the Iowa has to be found and symbolically returned, and that's how you break the cycle of Obanje. So anyone who considers himself or herself as an Obanje, the question is there something being done about it, or is it sort of a half gesture identification with this important phenomenon in Igbo culture? Because if it is referring to the Obanje of Igbo culture, then the question any Igbo person who understands that culture would ask is, so what are you doing about that? What is your family doing about that to break that cycle, to go and retrieve your Iowa? That's how I will answer that question.
when you speak to Chimamanda, I read in this book by Akweke that it was Chimamanda that actually told her that she is Obanje. So you can bring it.
Chimamanda is a diviner.
So maybe you can bring that up. Now we have like 10 minutes before we bring in the audience. I don't know if we can cover all the other topics.
Sure.
But before we even move further, I want you to talk about this case at Chicago State University with Bola Tinubu. You're an administrator in a university in America. What is the process? What are we not getting? If this were to be Princeton University and your student became president somewhere and someone wanted to know, and there's this controversy, what is the process like at your university?
Well, I don't know the details of the court case, I must say. But what we have seen is that the Atiku lawyers petitioned the court to compel the Chicago State University to release Bola Tinubu's records so they can verify the claims that he made or the documents he submitted to the authorities in Nigeria. I think that's, and Chicago State University rightly says they can't just put these documents out there because, you know, this is the United States. These are personal documents that are protected by law from someone just putting them out there. It's the same issue with Obama's birth certificate, right? You couldn't just get a hospital to say, put it out there. So they are in their right to say, we cannot just give this to you because, except if a court orders their release. And I think that's where they are now, whether the court will order the release or is delaying making the order and so forth. The other part to this question, of course, was the diploma that some are claiming could not have been released by the university. But I also understand that Chicago State University says they can't confirm the authenticity of that diploma. That's the part that I find a bit strange. Because I Princeton that I know of, or even the University of Nigeria that I knew of then, you knew what style of fonts, you know, who signed what document at any given period, given who was the registrar, given who was the dean of academic affairs, and so forth. So I'm not quite sure if it is why the university says they cannot, say whether that document is genuine or not. That I find a bit arcane because, yeah.
All right, let's go to the other part of the work you do, which is helping to return stolen African artwork all over the world. Can you tell us a little bit of that? We know that last year, I believe, or sometime this year, that the Benin bronze were returned to Nigeria. Or I don't know if they've come back or they are planning.
Some have, yes.
Okay, so where are things on that?
There has been a lot of progress on this question. Already in the 1960s and 70s, the Nigerian government started petitioning for the return of, expropriated, stolen, seized African art and cultural heritage that were residing and are still residing in Europe. Even Mobutu Sese Seko of the Congo was a leading advocate for repatriation of artworks and art objects and artifacts that were mostly in Belgium in the case of the Congo. The Nigerian government has been pressing, especially for the so-called Benin bronzes, which we may know are not really, they are not bronzes and they are not all metal. They're actually brass works. But we use bronze as a catch-all for both wooden, ivory, metal works. that the British Army took from the city of Benin in 1897 when they destroyed the city and removed Oba Ovoramwen from office and sent him into exile. We still do not know how many people died in Benin during that invasion. The important thing here is that Benin, or rather Britain, the soldiers, and the Foreign Office properly documented what they stole, what they took from Benin. Even in some of the photographs, the folks who made those photographs in 1897 or soon after wrote loot on them, right? So they knew that what they were doing is really criminal. But it was important to seize those objects so that they could auction them off to pay for part of the invasion. This was an argument made to the palace in London in order to authorize the invasion, that the high cost of the invasion could be offset by selling off the treasures that they heard were in the palace of Benin. So this was not an accident, or they stumbled into these objects and so forth. So after the invasion, they were auctioned off and sold mostly to German and today's Austrian museums. And the African governments since independence have been asking for their return. Nobody paid attention to them by any much. Until recently, I think in part because there's a new generation of Europeans who are more sympathetic to these kinds of questions about the problems that arose as a result of colonization. You also have a new class of Africans who are well placed, mostly in Western institutions, to have significant voices that these institutions can no longer afford to ignore. And then there's also the added fact that African states and countries are all beginning to pay closer attention to these questions again. And that's what's caused the kind of increased level and higher level of conversation around these questions. And we have had some important results, including the decision by the German government to return more than 1,100 of these Benin bronzes to Nigeria, to return their ownership to Nigeria. That's already a done deal. They have returned some of the works. Other institutions have made similar gestures, private and state institutions in Europe, but the big boys, really, meaning the British Museum, has not done anything. The Met, none of the US museums, except the Smithsonian National Museum for African Art, none of the other US museums have really come up. And that's why we're still putting as much pressure on them to do the needful, be on the right side of history by restituting these objects.
Now, there are people who are concerned about what will happen when they get to Africa, get to Nigeria, or anywhere in Africa, whether some people will steal them, take them back to Europe or America. What are the things being done to make sure that that would not happen?
To tell you the truth, a lot of that is more myth than reality. Yes, objects had been that were in the National Museum in Lagos, for instance, they have lost objects in their collection. But that's partly because of low infrastructure that we have across Africa, not just museums, but schools, industries, and so forth, right? So our museums are not as well resourced as they should. Our museum staff is not as well trained as they should. Things used to be a lot better in the 60s and 70s, but the general decay you find in the system impacted museums as well. So that we have to acknowledge that. But we also know that museums in Europe do lose things. The latest one is the British Museum, the very museum that everybody looks to and says, this is why we need to keep the Benin bronzes in the British Museum, or the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, because they are safe and they are well taken care of. Well, we just realized in the past month and a half that thousands of objects had been stolen from the British Museum, and even when they found that out, they, tried to suppress the news. So it's not as if, and again, this is a one instance thing, but the point is that you cannot refuse to address the problem of colonial looting of Africa by saying, hey, your museums are not that great, or that someone might steal, an object from the museums. That's why we won't address the historical question. In my interview, I think in 2018 with Deutsche Welle in Berlin, I did make the analogy of a robber, or rather a neighbor, something more benign, a neighbor stealing the neighbor's BMW. And I made that analogy because we're in the capital of BMW in Berlin at the time, stealing someone's BMW, the neighbor's BMW, and says, hey, I stole it. And by the way, I'm not going to return it because your garage sucks. Your garage, the locks are not that great, and you can't put a fancy BMW in that your decrepit garage. Well, that's what it sounds like, these arguments, that we have the fancy museums over here and we're not going to return the stuff that was stolen until you build great museums in your own countries. Now, the question really for me is that it is important to address first the question of restitution, and then deal with repatriation after that. And so let me explain. Restitution is addressing past wrongs. Reparation or repatriation is returning things back to where they belong. We can address the first one because actually that's the more important question, which is the determination of ownership and returning ownership back to the original owners of these objects. So if we take, for instance, the Benin bronzes, if the British Museum agrees to return ownership of them, that means that the Nigerian stakeholders will now become, once again, the official owners of these objects that are sitting in the British Museum. Now, that has a lot of implications, meaning that the museum can no longer do whatever they want with those objects, or lend them to anybody they want without permission of the owner. It also means that if there are economic benefits that are accrued to the British Museum by keeping them, that will have to go to the owner, perhaps shared with whoever is keeping the objects and maintaining them, until the owner is willing, is ready, and able to take custody of the objects themselves. And this can be next year if the Nigerians feel they have the capacity to keep these thousands of objects in their museums and keep them well for their people, well and good. They may determine that they are not yet ready to establish the right kind of institutional infrastructure to take custody of them, in which case they negotiate a long-term, loan to the British Museum. So they would then be keeping them as loan from the Nigerian stakeholders until the Nigerians say, oh yeah, we want them shipped back now. So it is important for me, and this has been my position. There are several other positions out there. My position is to settle question of ownership, and that can only happen if the other party, meaning the Europeans, agree that yes, these objects rightfully belong to Nigeria. And if they rightfully belong to Nigeria, then that settles a big portion of the question. Repatriation, we can then negotiate how many of them we want to send back next year, next 10 years, next 50 years, and so forth. And we'll decide if we want them to keep some of those objects as ambassadors, because we also want Nigerian art to be seen around the world among other excellent objects of cultural heritage that many of these museums have from all over the world. So where we are now is that in Nigeria, there's a Museum of West African Art, Edo, that is being established in Benin City. Part of its mandate, and I say part because that's not all it's going to be doing, but a big part of its mandate is to support these repatriation issues. In other words, they can help conserve, because they're building a lab. There's nothing like that in Nigeria today, a laboratory for artifacts. So it includes that so that we can actually take good care of our stuff. So this museum is going to come on stream. A part of it will be opened next year, and in subsequent years, other facilities in the museum will come on board. And that's a place to begin, by establishing institutions that can actually take care of our own cultural heritage, including the ones that are already in Nigeria today, not just the ones we expect will come back from overseas.
Thank you so much. I was reading up on some of the things you did in the past. I saw this story. You were talking about looted Biafran artifacts. Why is it that we don't know much about this? What is this about?
There are many reasons why we don't know about that, because one of which is the status of Biafra in the Nigerian imagination. Biafra is still a touchy subject in Nigeria. So I can imagine that part of the reason that discussions about the looted artifacts from Biafra, that issue has not been taken as seriously as it should in Nigeria. The other part is that it's even a much more problematic question, precisely because the Biafran war was 1968 to 70. So we're not talking about 100 years ago. We're talking about something that happened in the lifetime of many people who are alive today. And the people who are involved in that looting, some of them are still alive. And so I suspect that the reason that this has not caught on is because some of the players in that sordid business are still around in the West, some of them probably in Nigeria as well. The particular incident that you mentioned had to do with the auctioning of these two incredible artifacts from Eastern Nigeria. They are among the objects that were looted from Eastern Nigeria during the war. You had European dealers and merchants either on the Cameroonian side or inside Nigeria, sending people to go into the Igbo and Eastern Nigerian villages to loot many of these objects, ferry them across to Cameroon from where they were shipped to Europe. And many of the important museums in Europe and in the United States have these objects. And so when I took up this matter with the auction house, when they wanted to sell these two objects a few years ago, I called their attention to the fact that these objects were, because they had a provenance. Provenance means information about the object, how it came to their hands. They had indicated that they were collected in situ in Eastern Nigeria in 1968. So I called their attention to the fact about what was happening in Eastern Nigeria in 1968. In other words, that these two objects were collected in a war zone. And there's a UNESCO Convention of 1954 that prohibits the sale and transfer of cultural heritage from a place experiencing war or military crisis. So I called the attention to that and said, so what it means is you are selling objects that are prohibited from sale or transfer by a UNESCO convention. What did they do? They went back and removed that statement that it was collected in situ before selling the object. So it was my way of calling attention to the question about Biafran loots, which I had been thinking of and looking for a way to bring this to public attention. And the media that this attracted at the time pretty much set this on public record, that there's a problem about Biafran loots from eastern Nigeria that will need to be addressed. And I made it clear, it might not be in my lifetime, but I've put it on public record. Maybe it will be my children or children's children that will take this up if they may in the future. But it's waiting for authorities in Nigeria and all the Eastern Nigerian governors and political leadership, because this came from their states. Except, of course, if they're indicating that they're not interested in their cultural heritage, then I would have done my part as a scholar and critic.
Now, people listening to this will be thinking, okay, we're trying to recover what was stolen, but right now, at home, people are destroying the heritage that we still have. Christians, different people who will decide that these things are not useful, that they are dangerous. What do you say to those people?
Well, ignorance is not virtue. That's all I have to say. They're acting out of utter ignorance. When you think about the fact that it's Europeans that brought the Bible to our people, and while they were doing that, while they were sending missionaries to Igbo land, to Yoruba land, to Zulu land, to the Congo, to all these places, what were the missionaries doing? They were collecting thousands and thousands of these objects and sending to their home. And they are the very objects that are in the museums today that we are talking about returning. The point here being that it was the same Christians, the same people who carried the Bible to the Africans that valued these things enough to pack them up and ship back home to their great museological institutions. Maybe because they thought that these were important examples of world heritage. So if your religion is one that you believe tells you that you should not value your cultural heritage, then you're a lost people in every sense of that word. Because as Achebe said, that a person who does not know where the rain began to beat him does not deserve a shelter. So if what we have learned from Christianity is to destroy our cultural heritage, what made us a people, a community, a society, a nation, then why the heck are we even thinking that we belong to any community? So let me repeat again. The fact that some people believe that what religion they follow tells them to not care about their heritage, the finest examples of the artistry of their ancestors. If that's what their religion teaches them, I'm sorry for them.
All right. We're going to let the audience in, but before then, one more question. You were fired at UNN in 1996.
Yes.
Um, since then, you were settled in America, and there are many people like you all over the world in top universities in the world. When you look back at your time at the university in Nigeria, especially UNN, and look at what's going on there, what do you see? How do you feel?
Awful. I feel very awful, frankly. Um, I because this happened at a formative time in my life. I was quite young. I was in my 20s when I was dismissed from the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, along with 13 others. So it wasn't personal, right? Along with 13 others who had refused to sign a document that lecturers were asked to sign by some fellow who was brought in by Sani Abacha at the time, called Umaru Gumwok, as a sole administrator of the University of Nigeria and Nsukka. This fellow, who I have absolutely no respect for, insisted that all the lecturers sign this oath of undertaking and gave everyone 30 days to be of good behavior. Give everyone 30 days to sign that document or be dismissed. It's on record. It's only 13 people that refused to sign that document of whatever thousand lecturers at the UNN at the time. Some 8 out of the 13 had it worse, including Obiora Odechukwu, as some of us might know, that 8 of them were charged to a miscellaneous offenses tribunal in Enugu for arson and sedition. I wasn't one of them, so I was lucky. But the point is that that was how I left Nigeria under those circumstances. That Nsukka was my alma mater. I was the university valedictorian, and so this is something that I was and I'm still very passionate about. But what has happened to that university, and frankly, universities across Nigeria, is unfortunate. We've seen how many of these universities hire lecturers. People show up in departments with appointment letters to teach in those departments. Having said that, I still know that there are individuals in our universities who are doing incredible work, but with little support. Those are the people that I try to reach through my various networks to still identify with them in spite of the system. And unfortunately, with new generations of scholars, of lecturers that have been brought into these places, they're not retiring anytime soon. So there's no quick fix to the rot that has happened in the universities. My role is to find alternative ways, and that's part of what Africa World Initiative is doing. Find alternative paths to connecting with people who are still doing important work within our universities, to support them in their work in spite of the system, because it's hard to deal with the system, as it were, because you have to sort out the political landscape in order to deal with what happens in our universities. So I am still, it's still not settled in my soul what happened to the University of Nigeria and Nsukka under Umaru Gumwok. I hope wherever he is, that he is paying for what people like him did to the university system in Nigeria.
Is there any situation where you can go back and teach there? Considering that now I heard that some lecturers, before they start class, they have to make everybody kneel down and pray. I heard that you can't be vice chancellor of a university now unless you're from that area. They fight people who are not from there. There's so many things going on that was unimaginable. for a few years ago. Do you think you can ever go back there to teach?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
There is absolutely no circumstance that will see me return to a system that functions in that way. What will be the purpose? Right? Is it to go and make enemies, or is it to go and commit suicide? The way I see where I am now, I'm not here in Princeton for Nigeria. There's a bigger landscape. There are very few of us from the African continent here. So that's my landscape now. And things are not the same around Africa. There are places where you have relatively sane academic institutions. And if it means leaning towards those, then that's what it would have to be. Until Nigeria and Nigerians realize how bad they have run the academic system, both the state and so-called private universities and institutions. Perhaps it will not happen in this lifetime, but I will not stop reminding them how bad things are, because if you don't, they probably will insist on plugging their eyes and ears against being reminded that things didn't used to be like this. And this is really the point, because I sometimes you hear things like, oh, you're comparing Nigeria to the United States. No, just travel around the rest of the continent and see that things are not as bad as they are in Nigeria, and especially given how much resources that we have. That's why Nigerians are sending their children to Ghana to go to school. And we know that, those who can afford it, but what about those who can't afford it? What are we doing to their children? That is why sometimes I'm very upset about this, that you have our leaders who send their own children, beg to be admitted in institutions like mine, and yet they are running their countries into the ground, their education systems completely decrepit for the ordinary people, so that they can maintain their network of elite, political elites. They send their children overseas, they come back, they give them, the jobs and everything, so as to maintain their system. That's why I'm really very upset about this. And I must continue to say it until, and maybe whether they like it or not.
I asked that question because there are a lot of people I know, even doctors who leave the country, and now they look back and they see the impact of them not being there. With people like you out of the country, who is teaching the kids? And do we leave that way and say they are on their own? What happens? How do we?
It's a dilemma. There is absolutely no way, and this is my personal opinion, where individual gestures will be enough to get at the rot in the system. Now, I feel that I have more influence from where I am now. I can talk to anybody that is anybody in my home country and say to them in their face, this is wrong. And that has happened so many times. The political leadership. There is no chance that I can do that as a lecturer at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka. So I cannot delude myself that going back to teach at the UNN will do anything other than completely losing the voice that I have today. That voice cannot happen from the University of Nigeria and Nsukka. If I can call the leadership of top museums in the world today and say, look, there's a problem with your museum. What are you doing about it? And they act very quickly. It's because of where I'm speaking from. So I do not see how giving up, not just what I've worked for, because this has not come, out of someone's largesse or anything. It's something that I've worked for. But in terms of the impact that I can have on Nigeria, I do not see how I can do that from within Nigeria as a single person. So that is my position, that when I say that I don't see myself going back, it's one, that the context of life and work within the Nigerian system cannot sustain me for any length of time. Because I need to produce, I need to write books, I need to be among my peers. It's that. But it's also when you talk about the impact, I have far greater impact on Nigeria today than 10 of me doing the same kind of work at the University of Nigeria and so-called ABU Zaria. That's my belief.
That's clear. But what about the fact that your works are not, for instance, students in Nigeria, they may not be able to access your work. Maybe they can't buy your book. They can't afford to, what about that? People.
I have I can address that.
Hmm.
Some years ago, I made a gesture. So I'll have to be careful now so I don't call out my colleagues. I made a gesture to one of our universities to say that I could give my time to come to Nigeria every summer to give lectures free, to students, so as to get them to sort of get a sense of the kinds of questions art history is asking and so forth. They had a hard time saying yes to that offer. I understood later that it had to do with making them look bad. That if I come and I start talking to students, giving these lectures, that students will not, would turn their anger and whatever onto them. Now, that's very unfortunate. But I wished that things like that are possible. That some of us can, and medical doctors are doing the same thing. They devote their time, they come into, Lagos or Aba and organize a 2-week, workshop to treat this or diagnose that, and then they go back. They know that they cannot function fully if they returned to Nigeria. But they come in once in a while with their resources and their knowledge and stuff and try to impact people as much as possible. Now, that I can understand, and I would be very much interested, and that's, again, part of the reason we set up the center, to have direct impact. It may not be permanent, in other words, relocating to Nigeria to do that. One is that that's not going to be possible to raise the kind of resources that you need to have that kind of impactful engagement. The other is that, as I said before, having a platform in, as some would say, one of the leading universities on the planet, makes it possible to also have a voice in what happens at the highest level of the American academy. And that also in itself is important for where I come from, because it's hard to say, oh, you cannot carry with you that baggage, that identity, that person that was formed in Nigeria or on the African continent in your dealings with everyone else out there.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's go to our audience. When I call you, please go straight to your question. One question for each person. If we have the time, we can go around again. Let me start with you, Mazi Olivier. You're next, of course.
Rudolph, you want me to start with violence this morning, but I won't start with violence. How can you just say we should ask one question? You don't do. It's like you don't know what you are even the impact you are actually causing. Sincerely, Rudolph, from my heart, I appreciate this. I appreciate what you do. I mean, I said that because I consume podcasts a lot. I subscribe to some of the best podcasts you can think of in the world, and I'm getting more. Right? When I say more, because it speak volume, it speak home. When you bring people who are not just local champion, but they understand how society and system works. But most importantly, they understand how the world goes around. You don't understand how impactful that is. I'm getting value that I don't get while I was in college. Seriously, if you continue like this within the next 3, 4 more episodes, I can say I have a PhD, in what I'm getting here. I really, really appreciate that. And that being said, if anybody did there want to sponsor me, I want to go and do internship on that Rudolph, please contact. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. And
Okay.
to our guest, Professor, and I don't know where to start. This is my first time actually listening to you. I purposely not do any research or read about you. I said, let me just come and be a mumu and see how how you put me together. And you've said a lot that I really want to have conversation around with. Not that I disagree with you, I agree with, but you have touched some of the core issue that I want to learn more. So I'm looking forward to come to your office one day and spend maybe the whole day just tap into your knowledge. And again, specifically, thank you for that brief snippet of my kingdom. I'm from the Orifa family, so I belong to the Benin Kingdom. That little, that's a piece of information that a lot of people don't know, even me. And I was like, oh, okay, there's a lot going on in that space that I thought more than I know. So thank you very much for that a piece of information. Ponsat, if you are watching, you always ask me, say, I don't get clients, I don't come from anywhere. I just hope you you see what Prof just said. Now to my question. At the beginning of the conversation, Rudolph was asking you about the speech and what is going on with our system and all that. You alluded to when you are responding to that, you talk about how, you know, to paraphrase about how Africa needs to have for us to need to have a voice, is for us to need to come together. And that takes me straight to what Marcus Garvey stands for, right? The ability for us to have one economy, one military, one government, and all that. Well, you also went straight to Kwame Nkrumah's speech of 1963 about how he's warning us about the incoming of the new colonialism. While that was going on, I was paying attention to the comment section where Two Niger 2 was also in his usual stand, was paranoid, but this time around, it actually captured exactly what you are saying. Two Niger said that for us, the decades ahead of opportunities for Nigerians and Africans to break out of the control of the Western powers. If we fail, there will be a reckoning for us all. And I think it captured everything, even what you are trying to say or exactly what you are doing, going by the area of speaker that you are assembled to participate at the symposium, says a lot about your Pan-African view. Now, my question is, again, to the question that Rudolph also asked you about the Francophone countries. You use Mali as an example, and you said, what next? Not that you're actually against what is going on there, but what is the plan? You pointed out the fact that they still very much the Francophone, the French infrastructure that are put in place, that's still very much there. And that can also be said to the English-speaking African countries, but in particular in Nigeria. We are all product of those infrastructure, those structures that the Western world actually put in place. And that's why we're actually communicating with we are communicating. And I like the fact that you also trying to round up with Chinua Achebe quote. Make a talk for pidgin when you see anybody will know where rain started the beat from, deserve home. And that's my definition of Nigeria. We don't know where we are coming from. We don't know who we are. We don't know where we are going. We are a bunch of confused people. That is my own brief definition of Nigeria. And I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. So my question is, when are we going to be seeing collective action, not individual? Now, individual, because we see what happened to the life of Murtala Mohammed, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Gaddafi. I can go on and go. So that fear is still there. So when are we going to be seeing collective action, not just rhetoric, like what we saw at the UN in New York? Action collectively, so that the threat of, oh, if I go too much, I'll be taken out. So when are we going to see that? We're going to see in our lifetime. When I mean in our lifetime, I know we are not age mates, but if we are both lucky, we see the next 50 years, right? We can't ask for more than that. So are we going to see that collective action for us to actually have that freedom as a people?
Okay, thank you.
People, so we know where we are headed. So thank you very much. That's my question.
So my response is individual responsibility to the self and to community. If we cannot make better a small community, a small circles, or contribute to the better development of our family, our kindred, our hometown, state, nation, continent, it builds out. I am not one who does much of fantasizing, about the present and the future. It's what can we do now, right? What are we doing now to push for more responsible leadership? As much as I will say, call the Oyibo, as they say, to order, if I see them misbehave, I'm also very quick to point to our own people and say, hey, what are you doing, over there? There's the proverb, in Igbo, that the kite, it will first of all chase, or rather the hen will first of all chase the kite away and then call the chick and say, what were you doing outside? Right? So the problem with the European powers and the international economic and political system is there and must be addressed. But you cannot address it from a weak position. That is really the point. If you cannot keep your home in order, how are you even able to then ask your obnoxious neighbor, to behave, right? So the task of collective action begins with individual action, because it's only with individuals that actually believe they have a goal and an objective that can actually have any collective action. Otherwise, what you have are fractious energies, everyone fighting, in different directions. Ultimately, you achieve nothing.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go to Mr. James. Mr. James, you're next. Unmute yourself, James.
Yeah, I said good evening from the Gambia.
Good evening.
Thank you. You've spoken well. And you've touched on so many things. I would have loved to comment on what I call beautiful, useless speeches at the United Nations, but there are better things to talk about. Now, let me talk about the state of the Nigerian universities. Recently, I have the experience of a certain contract awarded to Nigerian professors in a certain African country I would not like to name, to review their curriculum, because the curriculum has been in use since 1999. The professors came and they left, and what they produced is despicable. I felt very ashamed. Because when I was a student at the University of Lagos, in those good old days, I cannot imagine a professor like Professor Nuruddin Alao, who was a vice chancellor, to desecrate himself to that level. And this is what we saw during the general election, the last elections, where university professors are now becoming returning officers. In the Gambia here, where I live, the job of returning officers is meant for high school dropouts, not high school graduates. And I felt ashamed that the vice chancellor of the University of Lagos, a woman, was, I think, the coalition officer or returning officer. What is going on?
Yeah.
What is going on? So the problem is, personally, I'm living in the fear of bondage and the bondage of fear because of the way the country is being governed. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think you're pointing again to the rot in the university system. Professors are, well, deserving professors, self-respecting professors, and I think I know what that means, have no business, being returning officers in elections. This is part of the problem, that the university has so debased itself, and this started with generally during the regime of Ibrahim Babangida. That was when the problem started, when he started appointing professors, to political offices, and they saw money. And of course, money is like blood. When you smell blood, it's easy to kill again. That's what happened to the universities, that today we have professors being appointed commissioner. Are you kidding me? There was a time in Nigeria in the 1970s, and people have forgotten this. University professors, if I'm not mistaken, were second only to the Chief Justice of the Federation in terms of salary scale. University professors. So to imagine that today, someone in my position would be angling for bribing people to be made a commissioner in a state. That's why I don't talk to these people, because we don't believe we're in the same line of business. And I'm not afraid of telling them in their faces. They have if you call yourself a broken basket, your neighbor will use you to pack the rubbish. This is what has happened to our universities. So the people being appointed for curriculum, first of all, they would have bribed their way to be appointed to do these reviews. And then they turn in reviews that will not upset the people who appointed them.
Are you a prophet?
Sorry, no, I'm a professor.
Okay. It's as if you knew what happened. I mean, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. James. Let's go to Ihianyi. Ihianyi, is that? Am I getting it right? Yeah, Ihianyi. Next.
Yeah. Thank you, Rudolph. Doing a great job. Fantastic all the time. Just keep it up. Prof. Otegokwa.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. I just had to listen to you. I've known you for a long time.
Yeah.
Very close quarters. we know what we're talking about. So, you just touched on something, when you said the thing about the basket. I was about to go the same way when I was thinking about Nkilikebe, becomes the plaything of children. Mm-hmm. And yes, that was actually what I was going to talk about. Then you mentioned the basket, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to bring this up again? But it's the same thing. What is happening, especially at Nsukka. I was there 10 years ago. I was there, the last time I was there was 10 years ago. I haven't been able to go back because what I saw made me lose weight. You know, the way people say, I lose weight for one place. You know, and I'm just, it's not even a question. I heard you talk about the efforts that you've made after the painful experience of everything, and I just wanted to encourage you. That's all. There's still some of us out here, I mean Nigeria, who yearn for what we experienced, for the UNN that we attended, and in our little way, in as much as you've said, you know, you've talked about the fact that, you know, operating in silos and all of, you know, the fractious loss of energy and all of that, but in little ways we're looking for ways to liaise with others, to work with others as much as is possible to make whatever impact that can be made. Okay, so all I just wanted to say is I don't know how we can do that. I know you've mentioned some of the things that you're doing and all of that, and we are willing to add our little to just make that impact that little bit more, you know, greater. That's all. Okay, so that's what I'm just. Yeah.
Thank you, Hani, and it's great seeing you after many years. So that's wonderful. So just to clarify, what I meant is that if one is doing the needful,
Yeah.
right, for oneself and for one's family and society and so forth, the task will be to identify others who are doing the same. In spite of the system, in spite of our boundaries, whether you're Igbo or Yoruba or Anambra State or Adamawa State, there are people working in every segment of the Nigerian political economy that are doing important work, that are doing useful work. We just have to forget these boundaries that we, that we built around ourselves in, rhetorically, but also in real terms, and find people who are working in similar directions, and identify them and work with them and partner with them. This is the only way to save that country or even the African continent. When we think about Nigeria as a whole, it's a smorgasbord of, a variety of people, ideas, visions. You have to identify the ones that are close to yours and work with them, whether they are in the other university or in the other state or across the other religion, or whatever divides that we have, because that's where the future is. We have seen that ethnic, religious, regional alliances have almost always failed because the political class will invoke them when they need you and abandon them as quickly as you get them into office. So I just needed to clarify that whatever you're doing, find others, and it's easier these days than in the past. Find others who are doing similar important work as far as you're concerned, and try to work with them, to partner with them, to seek collective problems and questions that you can address yourself to, and try to find solutions to them. Perhaps it's the collective energies among these multiple collectives that Nigeria's future will depend on, rather than the big, umbrellas that we have that have not taken us anywhere. So thanks, Ihani.
Yeah, thanks, Prof.
Righteous man, you're next.
Yeah. Good evening, Rudolph. Good evening, Prof. Rudolph, your platform is very rich, and just pray that God will keep you and strengthen you. I've been very much blessed this evening, starting from the time you introduced Prof before you allowed us to enter the studio. Prof, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions or thereabout within a minute. And it's coming as a result. I want to take you from the side of religion and tradition. Could you consider Western and Arabic religions as a tool of conquering Africa and the rest of the world? That's my first question. My second question, is the Christian and Arabic religion a better replacement of African religion and traditions?
So, okay, so you want to put me into trouble, eh?
No.
Okay, so let me answer this in a way that hopefully people won't get feel insulted, because religion is a very sensitive thing. One thing we have to not forget is that that Christianity and Islam and Judaism came from the same place. It came from the same people. It came from the Abrahamic tradition, the 3 of them. And they are among the few religions that believe in what Soyinka once described as "I am right, you're dead." A lot of other religions, including most African religions, didn't believe in that. They were more accommodating of others, accommodating of difference. And that's what got us where we are today. That depending on whose hands the Bible is, it would have the same, it will behave with the same ideology of "I am right, you're dead." Not that you're wrong even, but "I'm right, you're dead." So whether it's in the hands of the European missionaries or in the hands of African missionaries, it still operates with that ideology or rhetoric. Whether it's the Quran or the Bible, is the same thing. One is much more political, that is Islam, because they, as a religion, does not believe in abrogating responsibility or investment in the now. Christianity supposedly is in the hereafter. And so Islam, right from time, wanted to play a role in the unfolding of politics. Christianity was playing fast and loose with that. If you look at the history, what I do not engage in is seeing Christianity as something that is not a historical phenomenon, because it is. It began at some point, it began somewhere, it moved across the planet in a particular fashion, and arrived at our shores at a given point. We know when they did. So it's not as if it just happened because God, threw the Bible down and we received it. We know the process of its movement across the planet, and that's a historical fact. What people believe is their thing. I can't quarrel with what people believe. But when we are talking about history of what happened and when, we know how that was promulgated. We know what happened at Onitsha in 1878 or thereabouts, when the Christian missionaries were negotiating for Britain over ruling Onitsha, and the pushback by the Onitsha people. We know that this happened at the level of Bible and so forth. We know that the reason the Igbo language has suffered more than any other language of equal scale, 30-something million people, is because of religion. Well, it's not even religion, it's because of denomination, because of the struggle between the Catholics and the Anglicans. That's what undermined the development of Igbo language, because the Anglicans did not want to follow the Catholics in the Onitsha dialect. So they went for the Owerri dialect. And that's why you could not develop an Igbo language that was pan-Igbo. So we cannot forget what history has contributed to where we find ourselves. What people believe, again, is their thing, and I do not want to controvert that. Is this for the same reason that I cannot, not that I cannot understand, but I cannot sympathize with anyone who says, well, I have this thing that tells me now that the past, that my ancestors and what they achieved are worth nothing. I do not sympathize with anyone who takes that position because of what they believe, because life is more than any one of us. We're all going to die at some point, but cultures rise and fall. Some will die because their people did not hold on to their cultures or did not hold on and support their languages. That's how cultures and languages die. There's a reason, and I'm sorry I'm going on about this, there's a reason why the French, their colonial ideology was not to teach you French language. The English did. Would teach you only English language. The French will teach you French language and culture. So when you learn French in school, you're also learning that the baguette is the best thing to eat in the morning, or that the wine that you have to drink wine after your dinner. That's French culture being instructed to young Africans when they teach you French language. So is it a surprise today that in Francophone Africa, they think that Paris is their home capital, or that being French is what they are, rather than being Akan or being Benin or whatever. So the point is this, that what language and religion has done to our people, we have to recognize that, regardless of, in spite of what we believe, what our faith is. For someone like me, when I think of artistic heritages, nations that do not have an artistic heritage actually often have no basis for claiming nationhood. That is why, and I was talking to Rudolph about this earlier, that is why during the